Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights Booksellers event calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we are delighted to have back in the house our dearly beloved Chris Carlsson, celebrating the publication of the second and newly revised edition of Hidden San Francisco, a guide to lost landscapes, unsung heroes, and radical histories. It's published by Pluto Press. Of course, Chris is no stranger to City Lights. We've had the great pleasure of having him in our orbit and also publishing several of his books. These include The Political Edge, also 10 Years That Shook the City, and Chris also co-edited Reclaiming San Francisco. Chris is a writer, historian, educator, tour guide, blogger, photographer, cyclist, book and magazine designer, and since its inception in the mid-90s, Chris has been the director of Shaping San Francisco, which is a community history project documenting and archiving overlooked stories and memories of San Francisco. He's also one of the co-founders of Critical Mass. Now, this second edition of Hidden San Francisco expands on the first edition by deepening its mission to peel back the layers of the city's history, revealing hitherto lost or overlooked aspects of San Francisco. It's a guidebook unlike any other. The second edition includes new tours on the wild and natural parts of San Francisco, as well as a new themed walk on the Summer of Love. There's also a new introduction examining the devastating impact of the pandemic, as well as a mini history of tech in the city from the gold rush all the way through to AI. The book is a natural extension of the work Chris has been doing with Shaping San Francisco. Any of you who've had the pleasure of taking one of Chris's award-winning tours knows how revelatory and delightful those can be. Hidden San Francisco follows in that trajectory. Chris is going to be offering a presentation, after which he'll be happy to take questions. So please post those in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. We're also going to be posting links there with which you may purchase books. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to our dear friend, Chris Carlsson. Always a pleasure to have you back in the house. Welcome.
Thank you, Peter. That's a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's very nice to be back at City Lights, even if from the East Coast wing out here in a barn in New Hampshire, where I'm sitting right now. But all's well. I'm really happy to be online with you guys, and I'm excited to present the book, which I'm really pleased with. It came out much better even than the first edition, and you did a fine job of introducing it. I noticed there's one little comment in the blurb that's not quite accurate. I didn't do a new tour based on the Summer of Love. That was a pitch that they made to me, and I ended up thinking, no, that's not really that important to do. However, I do have a in the can walking tour of that. So if anybody's dying to do it, you can track me down one day and ask for that tour, and we'll figure out how to make it happen. But in any case, the rest of the claims there were quite accurate. And what I want to do is just sort of start out giving you a little bit of introduction. I mean, I think Peter did a pretty good job of situating my work, and which, doing over almost 3 decades now of delving into the lost and forgotten and oftentimes suppressed histories of San Francisco. And, my biggest question that always drove me was like, how the hell did it get like this? It could be so many different ways. Why is it like this? And unpacking that ends up, bringing down all kinds of different issues around, how we understand the world, what it is to know things, basic issues of cognition. And since we started the project Shaping San Francisco, we ended up really coming face to face with these at the beginning of for what for many people was this new cognitive universe that's been created by the internet, in which you have all these hyperlinks and the ability to move sideways and up and down and back and forth in ways that are quite different than reading a book and having a normal narrative flow where you start the story at the beginning, you read the arc of information, and then you have a conclusion that drives home your points. In this case, as we developed the website, and which doesn't really come along until 2009, but the original CD-ROMs and public kiosks that we did put us face to face with those issues of like, how do you make sense out of all this, incredible number of voices that contributed to the history that we've systematically tried to integrate into our collection? So over the years, I spent a lot of time trying to build storylines, narrative storylines out of this cacophony of material. And that led me to become and it was a little bit of a Pavlovian experience, to be honest, because I was doing bicycle tours and walking tours and eventually boat tours as well. And we've been doing them for, many decades now. And, you have over and over again run into the problem of the punchline. Like, what is it that holds somebody's attention? What is it that keeps people coming back? What is it that makes people interested in knowing more? Well, it's, a story that has a point that brings you into a place where you feel some moment of recognition or joy or excitement or what have you. So with all that in mind, then I was sort of facing the prospect of shouldn't I be writing a book about all this and collecting all these stories, which is in fact what Hidden San Francisco is. And the first edition came out on February 28th, 2020. And as we all might recall, March 11th was sort of the shutting down of the economy started on March 11th of 2020. And almost all the events for the book and things that were supposed to happen around promoting it went by the wayside. And so, we did okay with it anyway, but the publisher, Pluto Press, was very enthused about bringing out a second edition. So there's a new introduction, and I'm going to read you a little bit from that. And then there's the original introduction as well. And I have a slideshow that was partly that I used for the first edition, but I added a number of screens, which you're going to see, which are reflective of these 13 stops in our new Eco Treks chapter, the new big chapter that was added to the new edition, which are really well mapped walking tours that came out of the COVID period when Lisa Ruth Elliott, my co-director at Shaping San Francisco, and we realized like didn't want to do Zoom, like everybody's doing Zoom for everything, right? And we were like, oh God, I can't do it. We did plenty of Zoom things ourselves, but we wanted to create a different alternative to our indoor public talks. And so instead of going online, we essentially said, let's go out and explore parts of the city that we haven't been to and that we don't know as well and that are kind of more obscure walks, and invite friends and neighbors who live along that area to come and join us and tell us what they can, and just have it be a more informal experience of talking to each other and really connecting to the urban landscape. So what you'll see in the slideshow at the last bunch of screens are images from those walking tours that have been added now to the book. So let me share my screen, and I'm going to play you a PowerPoint looping show. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to also read from the book. So you'll have an opportunity to hear some of the excerpts that I wanted to present to you tonight while this goes by. What you hear me saying doesn't correspond directly to what you're seeing, but that together give you a sense of the combination of materials that we're trying to get across with the book and with the work that we've been doing historically. So let me just put that on slideshow. There we go. Okay, so, to start off, I just want to really emphasize the fact that there's these issues of sort of cognitive coherence and narrative flow, which the book is an attempt to really kind of come to grips with. So I've said that a little bit already. And in this book, there's 4 main chapters that were from the original book: ecology, labor, transit, and dissent. And what I'm going to read you right now is the beginning of the original opening to the book, called, as you might imagine, Openers. The approach of this book embodies a commitment to history from below, to history as lived, to documenting our time alongside critical, in-depth, sometimes controversial histories. The histories we present here will deepen your understanding of where you are and how the city got this way, and hopefully help you see your own participation in the city's life, whether as a resident or a visitor, in a new light. In the following pages, you will find a complicated and contrarian historical understanding, a dissenter's history of San Francisco framed by the belief that history is a creative act in the present. We don't believe history is only made by politicians, business owners, and celebrities more than it is by the unsung and often ignored streetcar conductors, secretaries, ironworkers, organizers, dock workers, musicians, cabbies, and all the people that really shaped San Francisco through the years. Most of us don't tend to think of history as something we are actively engaged in, but that doesn't make it any less so. We make history together every day, both by acting in the world and by interpreting and arguing over a contested past. In fact, we're making history right now on this Zoom call with each other. As you walk or bicycle through the streets of San Francisco, you are contributing to the city's history. Stop and talk to someone, take a photo and share it online. Spend some time in a park or a plaza and watch the life of the city unfold before your eyes. Show up at a concert, a poetry reading, an art show, a political protest, and you too are indelibly etched into San Francisco's history. Who knows how your presence will alter your own life, or someone else's, or maybe even the trajectory of the city itself. This book peels back the layers of San Francisco history to discover memories, echoes, and ghosts of the city's storied past, often hiding in plain view. The pre-urban landscape, dramatically reconfigured by decades of digging, plowing, flattening, and filling, continues to undulate beneath the streets and buildings of 21st century San Francisco. From farming to industry to towering offices, city neighborhoods have been reinvented and re-inhabited again and again. Behind old walls and gleaming glass facades lurk former industries, secret music and poetry venues, forgotten terrorist bombings, and much more. And so as the story goes on, this project grew out of the new history, which is not so new anymore. It's about a half a century old, really, the kind of the movement of historians that wanted to reconfigure our understanding of the world around us with an eye towards history from below, from the voices that are mostly left out. So when we started the project, it was on this crazy game project, but that went by the wayside. And then eventually we opened all the content that we had produced and put on CD-ROMs and opened it as foundsf.org. So anything that I talk about or that you see go by on the screens here that you want to learn more about, you can for sure find a lot of in-depth material on foundsf.org, which is over 2,400 screens of material and growing all the time, because each and every one of you is actually invited on an ongoing basis to be a contributor. History is something that the muscle in our brain that thinks of ourselves as historians is mostly pretty atrophied for most people. We don't think of ourselves as agents of history very often. And when we occasionally feel like we're part of something, it's sort of like other people's thing that made it happen, and we're just like on the side of it. That's not really true. We are actively engaged in making history ourselves at all times. And we want to really encourage people out there to think of yourself as somebody who can actually contribute to the record. So the project began in some ways as brainstorms in the early 90s when there's an image right there on the far right from 2003. And then in the middle is the collage of posters from people carrying in the streets during the Gulf War protests of 1991, which was actually a big part of the motivation for figuring out starting this project. Because we just a few years later, we're already forgetting that there'd been this rather vibrant anti-war movement. And if we don't write down our own histories and tell the things we've lived through and tell the things that we've done, it's incredibly hard for us to go forward, together as a society. We really need to be able to situate our own practical actions. And of course, the Bay Area continually attracts new people to come here and start the revolution one way or another, politically or literarily or musically or what have you. And that's great. Welcome everyone who's in that camp. But it's also true that many, many generations have done this already and come here one wave after another over many decades. And to some extent, we all end up reinventing the wheel, at least in certain respects, when we get here and start doing our things. And so one way we were hoping to contribute to that, becoming less of an issue, is by recording a number of the actions that people have engaged in over the last 30 or 40 years, many of which I personally lived through, and thought, well, let's write this down. This is historically important. So that's a little bit of what we're doing. And so in the way the book gets framed is really with the four binaries that you saw go by on an earlier slide: labor and ecology, genocide and slavery, war and anti-war, and modernism and romanticism. I feel like these binary themes run through almost everything that comes up in the book. Labor and ecology are important to me because I came of age in the 70s. I was an ecological activist early. Got involved with labor politics very early, helped start Processed World magazine, worked on that for 13 years of my life. And that had a strong ecological bent in addition to being a magazine about the stupidity of modern work. And the truth is that most of the work we do is contributing to the ecological disaster, right? Like it or not, every way that we go to work and participate in our daily work lives in some fundamental way is producing the mess that we're living in, that we call the collapse of the climate and the toxic waste and radioactive nightmare that we're unfortunately surrounded by. And so you can't talk too much about ecology without understanding the work that has gone into creating the mess, nor can you really understand labor politics without understanding the ecological context in which it takes place. And of course, San Francisco, as you see these beautiful pictures go by, is this place that constantly inspires us with its beauty. And most of that beauty is dependent on the social movements that preceded us, that saved those landscapes, like that Marin landscape that you see in the distance across the Golden Gate in that photograph is absolutely only there because of the social movements that saved the Marin headlands from turning into freeways and suburbs. And this is again and again the Save the Bay movement, the anti-nuclear movement, the freeway revolt, the things that are coming up already in some of those slides are part of that. So when we think about labor, we think about ecology. When we think about ecology, we're thinking about work and labor. So that's one of the dualisms. Genocide and slavery is a little bit less obvious binary. They actually go kind of hand in hand, unfortunately, and we're seeing aspects of that going on in the world right now. But when you look at the point of origin for San Francisco, you cannot escape the fact that it couldn't have happened without the labor of native Californians who had preceded the arrival of the Americans and then became the object of this incredible slaughter that took place throughout California for better part of 20 plus years, and was paid for by state and federal government. And there would be basically gangs of white, awful humans going out marauding and looking for Indian villages, slaughtering everybody in the village and stealing the children and selling them into slavery. And at a certain point in the 1850s, the first decade of San Francisco's life as a biggest city in the free state of California, quote unquote, 1 out of every 4 households in Northern California had an Indian slave child living in the household, working for them. That's one part of the slavery story. The other part is, of course, people who were brought from the South, people from African American descent who were brought here as slaves before it was a state and were kept in slavery into the early 1850s and well into that decade. Courts in San Francisco continually returned people to their slave conditions and sent them back to the Deep South if the owners were inclined to take them. And so that was a really crucial part of the backbone of the labor that was carrying the state forward in terms of that early period. Of course, Chinese labor came in large numbers really early as well, which is a product of the Opium Wars to no small extent, of destruction and dismemberment of Chinese society during the decade preceding the gold rush, led to large numbers of unattached young men needing to find a way out and get somewhere. And many of them came to California and participated in the gold rush. And many of them ended up being agricultural laborers who were key to creating the wheat booms and the other kind of agricultural booms that took place in the incredibly deep and rich soils of the Central Valley and the Delta areas. And they knew a lot about farming in deltas because that's where they came from. So they were in some ways not enslaved quite as chattel slaves, but their conditions of work were incredibly exploitative. So the level of coerced labor there was quite profound. And then, of course, the last category of coerced labor that never gets mentioned hardly at all is sailors. And, there's a slide that went by earlier about Shanghaiing, and that's a kind of a whimsically, talked about in a funny way nowadays because it's such an odd thing to imagine, going and having a drink on Pacific Avenue and getting, suddenly waking up. You go down and have a drink, and next thing you know, you're waking up, you're at sea, and somebody has basically slipped something into your drink and dropped you through a trap door into a waiting rowboat, rows you out to a boat, you go off to sea, they put an X on the papers saying you've agreed to go, and now you're at sea, you have no rights, none. And the captain controls you, and it goes all the way into 1897, 3 years before the 20th century begins. The Supreme Court of the United States held that sailors were deficient in the full capacity of normal adults, and they were not protected by the 13th Amendment's ban on involuntary servitude, i.e. slavery. So throughout the 19th century, sailors were held in a condition that was extremely close to slavery until their time was up, and then they could leave. So it wasn't lifelong slavery, but the conditions were that harsh. The next binary war and anti-war comes up all the time, because here we are, the epicenter of the war machine. The Silicon Valley now is fully tilting back towards its original point of origin in defense contracting, or I should say war contracting, which burgeoned after World War II. And now, this whole AI boom that we're living through in San Francisco, many, many, many of those companies are focused on AI for the military. And there's only going to be more of that because there's no money on the commercial side of it. So it looks like that's the only thing that's going to keep that bubble from popping is massive military contracts, which obviously the current government's happy to give them. But this is also the epicenter of anti-war movements. San Francisco, again and again, going back to the 19th century, has had strong dissenters, whether literary or activists or what have you, who have led the public charge against the venality and brutality and simple barbarism of the war machine that has been built and promulgated from here and sent around the world. Mark Twain famously was part of the Anti-Imperial League of the United States, fighting against the conquering of the Philippines, which was one of the great frauds in modern history. It goes on and on, through there. World War I had all sorts of dissenters. Obviously, there was a tremendous backlash by the federal government during that time. You had large numbers of anarchists dissenting in the World War II period, many of them conscientious objectors. Lots of people stood up, and Kenneth Rexroth famously and other people like him stood up against Japanese internment when that took place. Didn't get as much support as you might have hoped, but nevertheless, there was always people standing up here. And then, of course, all the wars since then, Korean War, Vietnam War, all the wars in the Middle East, we've had very large social movements here who have done their best to, put themselves in the way of that being able to continue. And I'm happy to be part of that, but I can't forget that while we've had these efforts made to block all these war machines, we've also been, economically dependent on the war machine. And most of the, current new lands around San Francisco, whether it's Pier 70, where the old Union Iron Works was, or Hunters Point Shipyard or the Presidio, what have you, all of these are former military bases. And it's hard for us now to remember how important it was to have, sailors and soldiers wandering through the streets, hanging out in bars, and being a big part of the social life of the city for a long time. So that's one of those binaries. And then the last binary I'm going to read you, it's from the book, and it's towards the end of the first the opener's chapter, and it speaks about this binary between modernism versus romanticism. Almost everyone harbors at least a bit of romantic nostalgia for the city that was, especially if they never lived in it themselves. As a young urban center less than 200 years old, San Francisco tends to emphasize and glorify anything it can romantically claim as its history. In almost the same breath, San Francisco's long history of poets, writers, and iconoclastic journalists have repeatedly cast a sharp eye on the machinations of money and power here. Singers and musicians, many in San Francisco, wrote the soundtrack of the late 20th century, a heady mix of heart, hedonism, and howling opposition to the dominant society. Monopolists and militarists, politicians and businessmen have all been stripped bare by muckraking investigations and bawdy ridicule. This civic reflex comes into conflict with the untrammeled pursuit of the modern that San Francisco is also well known for. San Francisco is practically a laboratory of modern life, from its origins in land seizure and enclosure, to the massive exploitation of nature and cheap labor, to the efforts to stabilize and maintain a world based on gross inequality, a collapsing environment, and hair-trigger threats of war, based on a new foundation of surveillance capitalism. Hat tip to Shoshana Zuboff for that. San Francisco quixotically saved its iconic cable cars in 1947, and a decade later, presciently fought off a bunch of freeways. But it also has the hideously designed, by Bechtel Corporation, modernist BART train system and grandiose plans to bring the future into the heart of the city with the long-planned California high-speed rail system. Well, we'll see about that now. Historically preserved and protected buildings are all over town amid the dull brutalism of new modernist palaces for the nouveau riche of the 21st century. During the 1970s high-rise revolt, San Franciscans resisted Manhattanization of the city. Now, skyscrapers crowd the monotonously expanding skyline, while resistance to height limits has shriveled in the face of a highly profitable and increasingly vertical new urbanism. Downtown has more than doubled its acreage since the late 1960s, when activists stopped U.S. Steel from building a 50-story monster in the Bay, just north of the Bay Bridge. From the top of Rincon Hill all the way to the Washington Street boundary on the north, from the Bay Shore to Fifth Street, the whole South of Market has been annexed into a downtown convention center, office, and residential high-rise zone. Just south, in the former rail yards of Mission Bay, a city within the city has popped up in the past 25 years, characterized by a sprawling expanse of glass-clad offices and condominiums around the 42-acre UCSF medical campus. The full length of Market Street is undergoing an unprecedented transformation from old department stores, neighborhood shops, early 20th century offices, theaters, and apartments into a shining procession of new malls, high-rises, and luxury condominium developments. This was written before COVID. Victorian and Edwardian buildings are being rehabilitated into luxury dwellings all over town, preserving the old facades while modernizing the interiors. With its pseudo-historic streetcar line and Potemkin Victorians, San Francisco has been carefully coiffed and manicured to reinforce the local economy's dependence on tourism. San Francisco is a global city, repeatedly regaled as a trendsetter, a city at the edge of the continent where countless thousands have come to discard old identities and resurface with imagined pasts and uncharted futures. Innovators have been welcomed by a bohemian culture suspicious of fixed truths, ossified class boundaries, and imported traditions. Music, literature, poetry, technology, art, cooperation, and collective invention have all flourished in San Francisco. The same cultural dynamism has also provided a rich foundation from which huge corporations have grown to straddle the globe, while their owners have exercised an enduring control over the city's growth and development. San Francisco holds a vital place at the heart of modern world history. The city's own saga is barely 200 years old, and yet those years straddle the U.S. imperial push across North America and into the Pacific. The Industrial Revolution and the emergence of class war, mass immigration and racism, technological breakthroughs from railroads to photography, agriculture to chemicals, machines to microchips, and more. It's also an epicenter for resistance to war, home to the beginnings of the anti-nuclear movement in the 1950s, the neighbor-driven campaign to stop the freeways in the 1960s, the unparalleled success of the Save the Bay movement in preserving and cleaning up the San Francisco Bay since 1963, and for changing how we live among ourselves by shattering norms of racial, sexual, and gender stereotypes. The city's immigrant ethnic groups continue to organize and resist the deep historical racism that has dominated elite policymaking here. San Francisco manages to be both a beacon to malcontents and nonconformists, and one of the most tightly run oligarchic municipalities in the country. The distribution of power and influence results from an endless tussle between competing interests, factions, organizations, and movements as they ebb and flow across time. Moments of contestation and conflict saturate our past, whether we know it or not, as our predecessors made decisions that continue to reverberate down the years. A definitive portrait of how we got here is elusive, but by revisiting locations and histories across the ever-changing landscape, we can uncover continuities and contradictions and present our version of how the city arrived at this moment. Like any history worth its name, it's not meant to be the last word, but a contribution to our ongoing shared efforts to understand how the hell it turned out like this. So that's the end of the opening chapter to the first edition. And now I want to read you a little bit from the, I'll just read a little bit of the conclusion. I'm going to skip over one other kind of semi-lengthy excerpt I have here on a brief history of public health in San Francisco, which is in the new preface in the wake of the pandemic. And if you haven't looked into that, it's a pretty interesting story about how repeatedly we've scapegoated mostly Chinese, but other populations as well, and treated disease as essentially not as a public health issue, but more as the failure of poor people to take care of themselves and live right. And here we are doing precisely that again as we go forward with the wake of the post-pandemic health process that we're living through. So I recommend you check that out, buy the book. But let me read you the end to the preface to the second edition, which goes on for a little bit, and then I'll open it up to discussion and questions from there. So I've kind of run through a series of examples of who was mayor when, going back all the way to Dianne Feinstein, one of the most conservative people we ever had to live with, even though she's Di's famous somehow a liberal. I don't know quite how she got that idea. At no point since the early 1990s has there been a municipal government that tried to implement anything close to a left-wing approach to the city's problems, unlike what all these people were saying during the last election. Of course, the recent history of San Francisco is much more complicated than any simple sketch can describe, especially one limited to describing the politics of the city's political leaders. More than a half century ago, the owners of wealth in San Francisco steered municipal priorities to back a grand bet that San Francisco would be home to the headquarters of far-flung multinational corporations to sustain its prosperity and well-being. Rooted in a consensus of the rich, city officials in local government, bureaucrats at the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, and anyone associated with a port or planning or zoning all worked to facilitate the rapid expansion of downtown. Skyline images from the late 1950s to the present show how densely the city was built up, a pattern not unique to San Francisco, but perhaps more dramatic because many people who lived here fought against Manhattanization from the late 1960s to the mid-1980s. In 1975, George Moscone was elected mayor, and he might have helped steer the city in a new direction, given his ardent support from the neighborhood activists who got him elected. But he was assassinated, along with the first ever gay supervisor, Harvey Milk, in 1978, and the corporatist Democrat Dianne Feinstein ascended to mayor. She focused on expanding downtown high-rise office buildings as the cornerstone of her economic policy. At the time, San Francisco was still home to Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Standard Oil of California, Chevron, Bechtel Engineering, Pacific Gas and Electric, Del Monte Corporation, Levi's, and dozens of other globe-straddling corporations. But during the 1980s, under the neoliberal market frenzy of mergers and acquisitions unleashed by the Reagan administration, one San Francisco corporate icon after another was swallowed up by raiders. For example, Bank of America was taken over by a North Carolina bank, Wells Fargo by a Minnesota bank, Del Monte by RJR Nabisco. The rapid expansion of suburban edge cities led to the other large companies moving their operations out of San Francisco. For example, Chevron moved its headquarters to Pleasanton in the East Bay. Del Monte went through a dozen further sales and reorganizations before ending up as a subsidiary of NutraAsia in the East Bay town of Walnut Creek today. Though software giant Salesforce still calls San Francisco home after emptying most of its downtown towers, few other multinationals are based in the city anymore. The once seemingly safe bet on office expansion has soured, and the future of millions of square feet of empty office space is an open question. Current efforts to create pop-up cultural spaces, free leases for museums, etc., seek to kickstart new economic activities based on tourism and cultural production. But it's unlikely that any such efforts will rebuild the economic value of these 21st century white elephants. San Francisco's economic problems cannot be addressed at the municipal level alone. Objections to homelessness as unsightly and scary elide the simple fact that severe poverty is a necessary companion of the intense concentration of wealth that has settled here. You can't have the latter without the former. The boom and bust cycle that characterizes San Francisco's economy, going back to the original tech boom based on new hydraulic technologies to extract gold from Sierra granite, shows no signs of abating. The most recent tech boom popped loudly amidst the general collapse imposed by the pandemic. Subsequent efforts to reinflate a tech bubble by hyping the metaverse, cryptocurrencies, and most recently artificial intelligence have each succumbed to their own busts, AI just beginning its reckoning as I write, or perhaps an emerging pivot to positioning AI as crucial to new weapon systems will save it. Will the wealthy proponents of a nerd Reich manage to take over the city government? Or will they just continue to poison the city with their self-serving classist and racist expectations? San Francisco's subversive cultural pulse has not been completely silenced yet, in spite of the severe contraction of cheap rent, open space, and free time, the three elements essential to a city's thriving cultural life. Even during the depths of the pandemic, tens of thousands of San Franciscans filled the streets to protest the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and to support the ongoing campaign for Black lives. The fight is unfolding now, and it won't be resolved for years to come. We are not alone. The pandemic was clearly as much an ecological crisis as a public health one and a harbinger of more to come. The COVID-19 virus killed a lot of people and made many more quite ill. But it's worth pondering the deeper assumptions about life and boundaries it brought forth. As recent scholarship in theoretical biology argues, we are not really individuals, but whole societies of symbiotic and mutually constitutive species. Cruder politicians like to insist that they just follow their gut. And while that may be a dumb repudiation of intellect, the truth is that we all probably follow our gut in ways we can barely understand. The microbiota we coexist with are apparently more influential than we know. How does our relationship with our digestive system affect our thinking on any given day? How about our relationships with the animals around us, the birds and the bees? Kate Brown, writing in the New Yorker, expanded on this different way of imagining ourselves, and this is a slightly lengthy quote from her. The interconnectedness of our biological lives, which has become even clearer in recent decades, is pushing us to reconsider our understanding of the natural world. Our picture of the human body is shifting too. It seems less like a self-contained vessel defined by one's genetic code and ruled by a brain than like a microbial ecosystem that sweeps along in atmospheric currents, harvesting gases, bacteria, phages, fungal spores, and airborne toxins in its nets. End quote. In another New Yorker, Kim Stanley Robinson emphasized how the coronavirus was rewriting our imaginations. Not only did we have a moment to pause and contemplate the nearly 8 billion of us living on the planet, but it became starkly obvious that our bizarrely complex existence is completely dependent on all sorts of scientific achievements, from agriculture to medicine. As Robinson put it, quote, "We feel the reality, which is that the whole system is a technical improvisation that science keeps from crashing down," end quote. We'll soon be confronted with another pandemic, or more dramatically, permanently altered patterns of weather and water due to climate change. Just months after the pandemic took hold, California was ravaged by massive wildfires. San Franciscans woke up on September 9th, 2020 to a day without sunlight. A deep red hue provided the only light as the sun shone down on a Bay Area buried in dense smoke for an entire day. Weeks of smoky air continued to afflict Northern California, and most of us realized it was a new normal that we had to get used to. News from afar during the last few years gave alarming reports that Cape Town in South Africa, Sao Paulo in Brazil, or Atlanta in the US faced catastrophic collapses of water supplies. Each city dodged that bullet when rains appeared at the last minute and replenished nearly dry reservoirs. But as a global civilization, never more apparent than now under viral pressure, megacities are traipsing ever closer to catastrophic system failure. Science may help with urban redesign and technological improvisation, but not if we can't find ways to engage with each other politically and psychologically, and find previously untapped reserves of empathy, compassion, and mutual assistance. The pandemic led most San Franciscans to compassionate empathy and mutual aid. This happened even though for more than a year, most of us only saw each other's eyes from behind ubiquitous masks. But we also saw the inexorable rhythm of modern life grind to a halt. The air cleared and birdsong filled our streets, along with neighborly strolls, leisurely bike rides, and time to chat. Slow streets were claimed from the expectation that all public thoroughfares are for private cars, and in San Francisco, several were made permanent after the original impetus passed. A key road in Golden Gate Park was permanently closed to cars by popular vote after years of trying, and a similar campaign has now won to make the Great Highway along Ocean Beach a new urban parkway for pedestrians, cyclists, and other non-motorized uses. Coyotes expanded their presence in San Francisco along with raccoons, crows, and ravens and parrots. Whales, harbor porpoises, sea lions, and harbor seals are all more common in the Bay and along the Pacific shore than they have been in more than a century. Red-tailed and red-shouldered hawks are regular presence in our skies, and we've even seen a mountain lion make its way into urban San Francisco. The Natural Areas Division of San Francisco Rec and Park has preserved and expanded dozens of remnant habitats, more appreciated than ever during and after the pandemic. These areas are home to the original web of life on the peninsula, giving a boost to long-suffering native plants, insects, and birds. Between the break imposed by the pandemic and the ongoing efforts to bolster and restore natural systems in the San Francisco Bay Area, real results are beginning to be felt now. During the surprising interregnum imposed by the pandemic, the urgent frenzy to be busy subsided, and untold numbers of people joined a great refusal and abandoned crappy jobs they thought they couldn't live without. In the absence of incessant mass spectator sports and the time-filling routines of daily life, the biggest mass protest movement in U.S. history erupted to demand an end to racist killings by police. Millions of people had an enticing taste of how much different life could be. In the early months of the pandemic, it seemed impossible that we would go back to what had been, quote unquote, normal life. But as I write this, daily life again closely resembles what it was before the shutdown. Sometimes the pandemic years already seem like a bad dream, but we remember how real it was. It showed us plainly that things can change quickly and completely. The next time we face a rupture, whether due to pandemic, natural disaster, or social upheaval, maybe we'll remember what's possible and choose a life radically different from the one we have. San Francisco remains, in spite of everything, a place where such a radical break might have a chance, if we all do it together. Okay, thank you so much. That's the end of my reading time. And now I'm happy to unshare my screen. I'm sure you've seen it all enough by now. And
We've got a few questions trickling in, but I was really, I'm always impressed, and because you've also written some novels that kind of project into a possible futures for San Francisco. And the thing that always impresses me is how you mix the dystopian with the utopian, and the things are so intermeshed, really. And then San Francisco really is a place of great paradox and also great contradictions. And I think what I enjoy about your work is that you in a way, you're kind of teaching us how to live with them.
Teaching myself too, it's like part of doing the history work is to kind of, deal with my own passionate interest in revolution. I want to overthrow the world as we know it and have something quite different. But I've been, I'm 68 now. I've been doing this since 1970s. And so, better part of 50 years, I've been slogging away like all the good activists do. And I'm much less of an activist today than I once was, but I still feel like we have to do things to make the world we want to live in. It doesn't happen by itself. It won't happen because we wish for it. It'll happen because we take practical actions and bring it about. And part of diving into history has been so fun for me because I've realized how many times, well, guess what? That happened. It happened over and over again. There's millions of good examples of it. It didn't make the world as I want it to be, as perfect as it could be. No, not even close. But just think how much worse it would be if there hadn't been this mass social movement that blocked freeways being built through the Panhandle and up 19th Avenue and all around the city and basically wrapping the entire shoreline of the city in a double-decker freeway all the way to the Golden Gate Bridge. The bay itself, today I take boat tours out there, several times a year, and it's so nice to be on the bay. It's incredible. There's whales out there again routinely. There's harbor seals, there's sea lions, there's incredible bird life, and the abundance and the health of the bay is an impressive phenomenon because if we did that when I was first coming of age in the late 60s, it was a putrid, stinking mess. The bay was full of raw sewage. Nobody wanted to get near it. Every single municipality around the bay was pouring raw sewage into the bay. And it was the Clean Water Act of 1971 combined with the Save the Bay movement, which stopped filling the bay with garbage and industrial waste. That's what made it, after 50, 60 years later, we have a beautiful bay, something really worth honoring and supporting and spending time in and diving into on a regular basis and appreciating the shoreline alongside it, which of course, one time we called it the city front because, as people arrived in San Francisco for the longest time, they would arrive by boat. And the first experience they would have of San Francisco was to see the city and the city front in front of them, the front of the city. And now, of course, the common parlance is waterfront because we hardly ever arrive at that same spot by boat. We arrive by land, and so we've flipped our psychological sensibilities. But the waterfront's a place I like to go because it's beautiful and it smells nice and it's full of animals and birds and life. And thank goodness, if you go to Mission Creek or the Presidio, there's restoration projects that have been insanely successful. And it shows that you really can have thriving nature in an urban environment in the city, and we need it. We depend on it. And
and it's fascinating too how oftentimes it's a bunch of little old ladies that can sometimes make the biggest difference in the world.
That's true. It doesn't take, you don't have to be like, some expert a lot of the time. You just need to take the everyday action of going out there with your trowel or, nursing taking the garbage away from the native plants that the butterflies are eating and that are giving life to the birds, et cetera, et cetera. One thing leads to the next. And so, those small acts are quite big in the long run.
Yeah. But even the lobbying, I mean, because I'm
Oh,
specifically
yeah.
referring
Yeah,
to
that's right.
preservation in San Francisco, is that quite literally it's been retired people or people who have had time on their hands and felt like giving something back
Yeah.
and felt a loyalty to the city and to their memories that against all odds, oftentimes against massive odds, would be like, no, we're not going to have another freeway. No, we're not going to have, you're not going to be building more high rises, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up because the truth is that most of these movements the backbone is women. And it's not just elderly women, but it's all kinds of women from all kinds of walks of life, but typically people who had time. Because of course, when you had the single wage earning families back in the 50s, it was still, San Francisco was very majority white city full of typical family, nuclear families, very Catholic, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of the folks on the West Side and like, for instance, in Glen Park, who fought to block the freeway growth, were women who were bringing their kids to the parks in those areas on a daily basis, picking their kids up at school and hanging out of the park. And they're like, "You're not putting a free. This is my park. You can't do that." And then they just doggedly pursued it. And and the engineers, which were typically, white men in the black squared frame glasses and having white shirts with thin ties and the slide rule in their pocket and completely, like, these are just crazy women. What are they doing? How dare they challenge our expertise? We're the experts. We know how about throughput of traffic, and that's all that matters. Is throughput of traffic. And that logic was broken by a wide variety of different women stepping up out of different situations. And, and that's in the freeway revolt. But the Save the Bay movement was also backboned by, wives of important men, quote unquote, at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, that is, and then become a really grassroots movement where kids and school teachers really led the charge to a great extent of picking up garbage and making it a shame, literally shame to not treat the bay better. And everybody's like, yeah, you're right. We should fix that. So then there's a bunch of other fun stories buried in there, but I won't go on.
Let's see. Mike comments hydraulic tech boom of the 19th century, quote unquote. Wow. Did Adolf Sutro make his riches that way, then settle into mayorship?
Well, that's a good question. It's not, Sutro's money was made by developing a pumping system and an elevator system in the silver mines of the Comstock lode. And he did it in a way that was somewhat unfinancially sensible, but he did it because the workers' condition of life in those mines required it to make it like you could not die, A, and have fresh air coming in, B. And the workers at the mines loved him for it. And he made a fortune by selling that technology and getting out of it at a key moment. But the hydraulic technology refers to the washing away of the Sierra Nevada by the giant streams of high pressure hoses that were invented by the metal workers and the metallurgists in downtown San Francisco, right where the Salesforce Tower is today, and just to the south of it, where it's called Foundry Square. You might wonder why it has that name. Well, that's where the Selby Shot Tower was. That's where a number of other ironworks were. The Vulcan Ironworks, for instance, the Union Ironworks was right in that area. And these were the men who figured out how to make these nozzles so that they could take cow hides and make them into these long hoses and put these new metal nozzles on the end of it, and then use the hydrostatic pressure of water coming out of the mountains into the hose, and then make a really hard jet of water so strong that it could wash down Granite Mountain. And the reason is because the old gold streams, old streams with gold in them, were high up in the granite. And what that led to was the washing away of the equivalent, by most reckonings, of 8.5 Panama canals worth of debris out of the hills and mountains of California and into the river systems, silting up all the rivers, blocking navigation, destroying farms, all these things happening. And the hydraulic mining went on all the way till 1884, when the Sawyer decision happened at the Supreme Court, which some people now think of, oh, it was a great environmental decision to stop hydraulic mining, but it was actually it was a private property decision, as everything for the Supreme Court is, on behalf of a farmer downstream who was an absentee landowner, lived in another state, could bring his case in a federal court, thereby circumventing the California courts, which always decided on behalf of the mining interests. And then the miners were told, you can no longer you can't bury this guy's farm in 65 feet of rock and mud and debris. Sorry, you just can't. And so his private property interest won. And then one by one, each river had a lawsuit on it that led to the same results. But hydraulic mining continued, and it was spread throughout the world. And it goes on today in Indonesia and in Brazil and India and all sorts of places, that it's very devastating ecologically. And so it would be good to bring it to a halt in general. But that particular tech boom was the first real noticeable, innovative tech boom that started in San Francisco.
Yeah. So everyone, just want to remind you, please do post questions and comments in the chat function. Anne says, thanks for reminding me of the number of urban hiking trails in San Francisco. And yes, indeed, there's quite a bit here.
Yeah, it's fun too. Once you get out there and start exploring, you just get hungry for more. So I've kind of found myself trekking over the whole city again and again over the last 20 years. But some of those spots are so magical. You just can't believe you're in the city when you get there, like to the top of even, that Edge Hill Park. I've only got there quite recently in my life. There's things that you still have to have ahead to discover, even if you're a pretty intense walker as I am, or a bicyclist, and really get around the city. Hilltops are always, the last place you get to, just because of the physical effort involved. But I always recommend, follow your nose, just go wherever you feel like you haven't been before, try to get lost, look for weird stairways, or look for streets that end in what seem to be dead-end cul-de-sacs that very often have secret stairways that go off the end of them, either up or down. And you can really discover incredible things that way. And then if you have a book about, butterflies or native plants or any of that kind of stuff, or birds with you, you really can augment your experience by, bringing some binoculars and learning about new species that are endemic to San Francisco historically, that are often overlooked and forgotten when people look at the larger, more charismatic species that we also appreciate their presence.
Yeah, I think Herb Cain would have been charmed by the fact that there's almost more parrots now than there are pigeons.
Yeah, I'm all for that, absolutely. Although they're very noisy, they are very noisy.
But there's I park my car in a place where there's this like preponderance of parrots when I go to work, and I noticed that right around 6 to 7, they go quiet.
Uh-huh.
But the rest of the day, of course, they're going absolutely crazy.
Yeah,
But,
yeah, yeah. No, I've been super charmed by the parrots for quite many decades now, and at a certain point, we would always we'd do a walk, one of our many regular Shaping San Francisco walks starts at the Rincon Annex Post Office. And we do thanks to Gray Brecken's good work, the history of Anton Refrigier and what happened with those murals, which if you've never visited them, get out and visit them. They're still quite remarkable. And then after we go all across the old produce market area and the foot of Market Street and deal with all these interesting historical threads and whatnot, we finally eventually get up to Coit Tower by way of the Filbert Steps and see the murals that were painted during the general strike period in 1934 up there, which are also really worth visiting if you haven't done that. And I swear to God, every time we'd go up the Filbert Steps, the parrots would come and greet us. Like I just felt like they knew it was us, and they had to come and say, "Yep, we're here. Yeah, yeah, you're right. We live here." So, and I love the Filbert Steps Gardens and all the neighbors along that slope of Telegraph Hill who are quite good at maintaining one of the more convivial environments around here.
Let's see. Nancy says, "Love the parrots, even their endless chatter."
Yeah.
You write about the rising tides in your novels. In fact, the Warrior Stadium flooded a couple of years ago, pretty seriously. In fact, that whole area near Dog Patch, the water just comes in, when the weather is inclement. So, can you talk a little bit about where you think that's going to go? Because there's talk about building a retainment wall, but I think is San Francisco going to become a bunch of archipelagos?
Well, yeah, there's that great map by Burrito Justice that I think you can find it online. That's San
And it's in
Francisco.
the hallway of City Lights, by the way, too.
Of course it
So
is.
if you all come and visit, as you're going downstairs, it's on the right side. It's
Yeah.
been up there for years.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to find it online if you want to get one. They're actually beautiful and well worth supporting. But he prognosticated 220 foot of sea level rise, which is really a lot. That's like all the ice melted in the world, and maybe we're going to be there in 150 years. Not right away. But yes, the oceans are rising, and the city has got a fairly I would argue not a well thought out strategy, because most of from the ferry building all the way north to almost Fisherman's Wharf, the plan is to somehow reinforce and raise the shoreline, the seawall, which is actually quite old. It was built in 1912. I mean, a lot of that seawall in the northeastern corner of the city was built starting in the 1870s. So there's a tremendous amount of instability underneath the Embarcadero and underneath the piers. And that instability is seismically quite risky. So we know we're going to have a giant earthquake. As I always like to say, it could happen right now. It didn't, but it could have, right? And it could happen right now, and it didn't, but it could have. And it's that kind of craziness that we live with, that for most part we blotted out, because you can't just live your life like the next giant quake's about to hit. But we should take better effort to prepare for it. And one of the things that the city's trying to do by way of that is to harden the seawall. Now, one of the things that comes up with a hardened seawall, wherever you go, wherever you do that, is it doesn't take into account hydrostatic balancing pressure, where you have, the sea comes up on the outside of the wall, and the groundwater, which is quite substantial underneath San Francisco, comes up to an equal amount underneath on the other side of the wall, under the land. It just comes up through the land. And this is going to be really profound everywhere. I mean, it means that there's, you really have to question the sensibility of doing this, raising the sea walls. And the reason they're going to do it is because there's literally billions and billions of dollars of investment in real estate and infrastructure that will be flooded if they don't do something to stop it, or at least hold it at bay a little bit longer. So it's essentially an incredibly expensive act of kicking the can down the road. And I'm against it. I think it's a dumb use of money, and I think what we should be doing is figuring out how to have a process of radical deconstruction and managed retreat, and rethinking how shorelines interact with human uses and natural uses, et cetera. And the place where there's the most room to experiment with that in the short term is around the Islas Creek Basin, where there's a lot of industrial ruins already, some of which are slated for demolition because they're dangerous, like those giant grain terminals down there. And this is near the area where 3rd Street crosses Islas Creek. And the shorelines on both sides at one point were scheduled to be massive industrial developments that never materialized. And historically, a little further where the sewage plant is now, if anybody knows that the southeast part of the city, there's a giant, our main sewage treatment facility is down there, which has just been radically hardened with 12 to 14-foot cement walls all around it, and rebuilding a lot of the pumping stuff inside because it's at sea level. So if you have the sea levels coming up and you have your sewage system pumping things at that level, and you got to get it down to a place, but the water's above it, it stops working. There's all kinds of hydrological issues around this that people, they know. I mean, it's not like people don't know. But and I'm not a specialist, so my ranting and raving about this could probably be debunked by a scientific engineer who says you just don't know what you're talking about, and it's all going to be fine. But I frankly don't believe that stuff. I tend to think that we aren't taking seriously the need to reorganize how we live. And part of that reorganization is how we deal with our own sewage, our own waste. Like, we shouldn't necessarily be pumping it and piping it all to one facility that's at sea level and then having it treated through these processes and then dumped into the water. Perhaps we should be composting more, and we should be doing local composting, because we could tear up one lane of every street and turn it into urban gardens and farms. So I always like to say one lane for food. Why not just start radically reducing how much asphalt there is in the street now? So all the water that comes into the city goes into the aquifer and into the ground. And also we start really repairing the soils that are underneath all that asphalt and making them, worthy of generating food. And then we start growing vast amounts of food in the city instead of depending on incredibly exploited farm workers in the desert, growing desert of the central part of the state, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I could go on forever about these things. I have a lot of ideas how we could do it right, but nobody asked me, and I don't really think they're going to. Their plan is to try to protect private property, as usual. That is the overriding religious precept of our culture. Private property is God, and everything serves it. And if you're not serving it, you're a criminal or close to it, and you should be punished and definitely not paid attention to. So I'm not very punished, but I am not paid much attention to.
But some of these ideas have actually, come into fruition in other countries, and some countries which are not as affluent as ours.
Well, I think that there is a large range of ways that people are coming to grips with what's really going on, which is, sea level rise is real. It won't be like a tidal wave overflowing the whole city all at once, but the tides are going to come up and they're going to get higher and higher. And as I put in my novel, When Shells Crumble, which you graciously had me on for a Zoom call about that about a year ago, there's a whole sequence of king tides, which is the normal time each year, twice a year, when the moon is aligned with the earth and the sun, just so that it pulls the tides bigger, higher. And so what I decided to do in my novel, covering this period of time we're in now, up to 3 more years from now, or 2 more years from now, is to register each of those high tide moments and make them much higher, because I'm guessing that the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica might break off and a bunch of it melts, and it leads to a rather sudden dramatic pulse of ocean rise suddenly showing up. And if that were to happen, and it's so no reason why not, you can sort of play it out. Like Hunters Point Naval Shipyard goes underwater, but it's an incredibly toxic place full of enormous amount of radioactive debris left over from the testing of H-bombs in World War II and not during, but post-World War II era. That stuff's going to get pushed up to the surface by the rising groundwater as the area floods. And the same thing is true for all within that Yosemite Creek basin, where there's a lot of old Superfund sites that were designated years ago and never properly cleaned up. So we're in for it, in terms of how we manage these things. It's like, I can't wave my hand and say, oh, there's a magical, easy, obvious policy solution here. Just go do this and it'll all be okay. No, there's no such thing. We have very serious issues to face about how to manage the inevitable bad consequences of the long-term decisions that the people with capital have made about how to shape the city and how to manage our lives here. And it could be really different, and we definitely need to take steps to make it different going forward. That's part of learning the history, is to figuring out what is the platform from which we can actually pick a different direction to go in, rather than the same trajectory that we are blindly on through being amnesiac about how we got here.
Yeah. So Chris, tell us a little bit about your tour and what's coming up for those who might not have taken a tour yet. And, just also, I have posted links for Chris's website. So if you want to keep up on what he's doing, like, that's the place to go. So what's happening?
We have a tour coming up right soon with Rainbow Groceries having their 50th anniversary, and Rainbow Grocery, along with City Lights Foundation, you guys are our ongoing legacy business sponsors who give us, a kind bit of money each year that helps us do a lot of free programming. So all of our programs are free now. We decided forget about asking for specific fees or suggested donation, all that stuff. Yeah, we need money. We do. We're really small and really broke, but not broke, but we depend on donations to survive. But it turns out it's much better just make it free. Everybody who wants to give us a donation will, and people who can't afford it don't, and that's fine. You don't have to pay it. Everything shouldn't be turned into a commodity. So the next one will be at Rainbow Grocery on Saturday, August 17th, while they're celebrating their 50th anniversary. And we're going to take people on a little tour of the old Rainbow Grocery sites in the Mission and the old People's Food System warehouse, and just give a little deeper history of the People's Food System. And Rainbow was in it briefly and then left it early, and that's part of why they survived what ended up happening to the People's Food System, but it's still part of their history as well. So that'll be on August 17th from 2 to 3:30 at Rainbow. Everybody knows where that is, I think, at Folsom and Division. And then I have a boat tour. I think it's on, I believe it's September 20th, but you should go check it at fishemeryville.com or check it at my website, chriscarlsson.com. And there's a shoreline tours. And so there's 2 boat tours this fall. They're not as cheap as I would like them to be, but they're really fun. And you get a big download on by going up and down the shoreline of San Francisco up close, and you get in and out of each of the coves. And we talk a lot about some of these sea level issues and shoreline development issues that have come up in the last few minutes. And then the Northern Shore Tour, which is the one in September, we go up the northern side of San Francisco, northeastern shoreline, and then cut around the northern shore and then under the Golden Gate Bridge and back around behind Alcatraz and do the whole thing. So that's actually really entertaining as well. So 2 different tours that you could take with me on the boat. And then during the fall, I do a cemetery tour. I tell you where all the dead bodies are buried. We call it the spirited tour of the Colma cemeteries. And it's always as close as possible to Halloween or the Day of the Dead. And this year it falls right on the Day of the Dead on Sunday, November 2nd. So that's like a 3-hour bike tour up and down some pretty, they're not insignificant slopes. There's some hills out there. So if you're going to come, you got to be ready to ride up and down hills. But it's a lot of fun to go through the cemeteries and hear the sordid tales of the wealthy elite of San Francisco and find out and see where they're buried and how they're connected to each other over time. And there's we have a walking tour about Market Street post World War II, which is kind of a new way of interpreting Market Street that we haven't done in the past. We've used to do the contested Boulevard walk, and now we're kind of going to shrink it down to the further eastern half of Market Street and really focus on, thanks to the work of Damon Scott and his remarkable book, The City Aroused, we have a whole new way of understanding that particular part of San Francisco's history and the role of how the police sort of funneled gay life into that zone. I mean, people may not realize, but there's that big brick building right down there at Stewart and Market called, it's the former Southern Pacific headquarters. It was there for quite a long time, the railroad. And at the top, they had a giant white letters SP that you could see from every ferry coming into the city for all the way for literally decades. But as Damon Scott brings up in the book, and having delved into many oral histories with gay folks who were here in the 50s and 60s, they said that's the SP that stood for Swish Palace. Because there were so many gay secretaries working for Southern Pacific for who knows why, but they hired men to be secretaries routinely for a very long time, and many of them were gay. So you ended up having this very large gay bar scene directly across the street where the Hyatt Regency Hotel is now, and then the Embarcadero Plaza area had the other major gay bars that the police sort of funneled all the action in there, and they of course were on the take, and there's all kinds of scandals, and every story goes on and on. That's the fun of it.
Yeah. The history of San Francisco. Chris, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for gracing our virtual halls.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real great pleasure to be here. I hope everybody goes out and buys the book, of course, and buy it from City Lights and buy other good things from City Lights. It's an incredibly important institution. We got to keep it going.
And we have also posted links to, if you pick up a copy of the book, if you click on Chris's name in the listing, it actually takes you to all of his other books as well. And we have a full selection. So please do check those out. Or also, if you're in the hood, please come on down, pay us a visit. We're in North Beach, and we're open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. pretty much every day. Of course, today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please take care, be kind to each other, And we hope to see you all again very soon.
All right. Thank you.